The topic today is compliance of food safety regulations by the meat sector in England. Andrea, over to you. Would you like to say a little bit about yourself first before you start? You're muted.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me and for coming to a lunch seminar. So my name is Andrea, as you said before. I am a research associate at the University of Bath, and I work mostly in environmental and health economics. This project that I'm going to present today is work that has been going on with the Food Standard Agency and the Institute of Policy Research at the university. So it is about compliance, and this is a team that has been involved in the project. So we have Eleonora Fiqueira, who's a professor at the Department of Economics. Is everything okay?
I can put it on.
Yes.
Because I was.
Can you mute?
Sure.
Everybody, please. Thank you.
That's okay. So she works mostly on labor, education, and health economics. Julie Barnett, she's from the psychology department, and she works in the Center of Motivation and Health Behavior Change. Charles Larkin, who's the Director of Research at the Institute of Policy Research. Irene Petro, who is the Economic Advisor at the Analysis Unit for the Food Standard Agency, and myself. So the motivation to do this research, well, working with the Food Standard Agency, is that foodborne disease is a cause both of mortality and morbidity. In the UK, according to a study done by them in 2020, they estimated that 2.4 million cases of foodborne disease in 2018. That led to more than 200,000 GP appointments and 16,000 hospital admissions. And of course, this has a cost to society as a whole. They estimated a cost of around 9.1 billion a year. And this takes into account the loss of earnings of the person who cannot work anymore for some days or months, but also the disturbance cost to the business, medical costs, and non-financial monetary estimates of the human cost or pain, both to the patients or to their family members due to the disease. So the problem with studying foodborne disease is the difficulty in linking the illness to the contaminated food. So around 60% of the foodborne diseases are called unattributed cases. That means that you cannot trace back what is the original food product that caused a disease. But from the information that we do have, we know that the meat sector has the highest negative impact, with poultry meat being the most common food associated with foodborne disease in the UK, followed by mixed meat and beef, which are in the top 5, according to an analysis done by DEFRA. Now, we started this project with the FSA because the current enforcement strategies that they have for auditing the quality and the follow-up of the regulations in the meat sector are very labor intensive and costly, both for the FSA and for the producers themselves. So the enforcement rely on a lot of on-site visits, and they have to have, for example, for slaughterhouses, veterinarians on site most of the time, and also auditors that go every 3, 6, 12, or 18 months to all the plants, depending on the risk level. So the general objective that we wanted to do with this study was to try to use data that was available to predict the degree of non-compliance among meat producers in England. And for this, we started with an analysis and summarizing all the relevant factors and behavior that had been documented in the compliance literature. So we did a systematic literature review of 145 articles on compliance that had been published during 2017 and 2022 within the domain of business and economics. And then with that, we we evaluated the relative importance of those different factors that we identified in literature within the meat sector in England. And for this, we use data from 2014 to 2022 of the audits that the FSA does to the meat producers. We also use financial information from the company records and demographic details from the Office of National Statistics. And then the final objective is to try to provide insights based on the data to predict a compliance of the meat FBOs with food safety regulations. Now, this is a work in progress, so any comments, questions that you have are fully welcomed at any point of the presentation. So first, we'll start with the literature review. So these are the main keywords that we use for our search. So we use our main terms. Sorry, I've been in Colombia for the last 2 weeks and a half. So my tongue is still getting used to the English again. But business, factor, compliance, and regulation. And we also use all the synonyms that were available for each of those words. Our main data sets that we search for were for Ecolit, Business Source Complete, and Web of Science, and xgboost. From that, we had a total of 16,000 articles, but we took away all the duplicates from the different data sources. And we had a total of more than 15,000 articles to review. Now, for the screening process, we identified first if the topic was related to our question of interest, which is the factors of compliance of businesses with policies and regulations. If the document was published between 2017 and 2022, if the document was read in English, if the source of the article was a scholarly journal, if the main domain of the study was business and economics. And for us, it was really important that the article included some data analysis for us to be able to compare the variables used and their significance or their impact in the study. And also if the unit of analysis was the business, because there is a lot of studies maybe in compliance that look more at a country level or at a personal level, for example, in terms of taxation, but we really wanted the unit of analysis to be the business itself. And finally, if the location of the study was a developed country, because we wanted to analyze studies that had taken like similar institutional countries, and developing countries would have like another source of elements that we don't have. Now, this is the map of the screening process. So when we started from the 16,000 articles, and then how we worked from the ones that after the duplicates, we eliminated some with unrelated keywords that were mostly from developing countries, topics about violence, mental health, that are not directly related to the topic that we wanted to study. And then we had the 7,000 articles, which we screened both the title and the abstract according to the screening questions. And then from that, we had 262 articles that we did a full text review. And then from those, we selected the final 145 that we took into account. Now, the main topics, so remember that this is about general compliance, not only about compliance in the food safety, at least in the systematic literature review. So the main topics of compliance that were discussed in literature of the articles that we took into account were disclosure, environment, taxation policies, general policies, employment, consumer interest, and then others that took into account bribery and human rights. So the main one was disclosure policies, and we also divided between those studies that were like voluntary policies and the ones that were mandatory. Food safety policies and other elements would go to consumer interest, which is the ones that take more into account the quality of consumer-facing products. So to study the variables that were taken into account into the study, we divided them in 6 factors that affect compliance. So the first part would be the corporate characteristics, and this includes elements like the size, the leverage of the company, company value, the firm age, which means how long have they been on the market, if they have any foreign operations. And the second element is the leadership, which there has been a lot of studies about the gender diversity. So that means the percentage of women that are directors or current directors in the company, the independence of the board, if they have a special committee for asserting like quality of the products that they made, or for taking into account the compliance to a specific accounting or environmental policies, the age of the manager, and the values of the company, or the values of the leader in this sense. The third one was the behavioral factors, and literature has taken into account element of social norms, perception of risk of the regulators. So how much do they think that they're going to be found out if they don't comply to the regulations, their past behavior, their trust on the government or the regulating body, and the importance of reputation. Now, in terms of more general external factors, we have the local context, and this is the GDP or the income of the place where the business is located, the location itself of the business, the level of corruption, the level of social capital or amenities that the area has, and the business environment. The fourth or fifth one is stakeholders, which is a network union. So about having a union, or in that sector specific, or how many people are part of the union in that specific sector, and the relationship with the suppliers. And then finally, the enforcement, which is the cost of compliance, the strength of the enforcement initiatives, the evaluation of specific policies, the rule of law, and the effectiveness in the evaluation. So these have been like the 6 main factors that have been taken into account in literature and that have been found to affect compliance, or that have been included to study compliance. Now, here we have like those categories, the number of articles that have included variables within those. So for example, 86 of the 145 articles that we studied included corporate characteristics. 58 included those variables with respect to leadership, 41 with respect to enforcement, 32 with respect to community, and then the final ones were stakeholders and behavioral. And here we can see the variables with the highest impact. So in this graph, we can see like the total number of significant inclusions. So of each variable, and so they were included in X amount of articles, but we only took into account the inclusions where they were significant, and we only took into account the variables that were significant in more than 4 inclusions, which was the average of inclusions for each of the variables, and that had a significance in more than 50% of the inclusions that they had. So size is the main variable that was used in the studies, and it had mostly a positive effect on the compliance. Profit was also the second variable, but it had more like a mixed effect between positive and negative effect on compliance, leverage, and so forth. Most of these variables, if you go through them, you can see that they come from 4 categories, which is the corporate characteristics, the leadership, enforcement, and context. Only one of the variables with the social norms comes from the behavioral factors. And this is in part because there's more data that is available for this element. So it is easier for researchers to include them in their studies. And the systematic literature review, we also took into account what sources of information they had. And for both the stakeholders and the behavioral category, more than 40% of their sources were confidential information, which means that they were like surveys that they themselves collected, but it's not like public information that is collected like periodically and that can be accessed by other researchers. So this poses like a limitation for those type of studies and variables to be included. Now, from that, we gather like from the four main elements, we gather the hypothesis that we want to study with the data from the meat producers. So first, then we want to analyze what are the impact of the corporate characteristics, like the size, the age of the firm, financial performance, and the influence of the level compliance of the meat sector, also of the leader characteristics, like their gender, experience, and their age, of the local context of the community where the business is located, and also of the enforcement strategies and how they influence compliance. So what is the context that we're going to be applying this analysis? So we have in the meat sectors, there's three different types of producers. So the main type is cutting plants. So that is, they don't have live animals, they just have the meat and then they cut it into pieces, package it and sell it. You have the some food business operators that have both of the activities, so that they are both slaughterhouses and cutting plants, so they do both activities. And then you have those that are slaughterhouses, those are the ones that have live animals and slaughter them. So there are 1,070 unique observations in the period that we took into account. So those are the amount of food business that have been operating at least in some moment of time through that period. Now, in order to understand a little bit, I'm going to talk to you through the process that is done by the Food Standard Agency, the audit process. So for a meat producer, first they have to submit a report that they want to start an activity and they have to be approved to be a business in the meat sector. And then they start an audit process. Depending on the risk factor of the determined by the FSA, they can be audited every 3, 6, 12, 18 months. In the audit, there is a scoring process. There is a total of 110 factors that they take into account. Not everybody has to comply all factors. So they are divided, for example, in animal welfare or other production activities. So if you're a slaughterhouse, you have to comply to all of them. But if you're a cutting plant, then you have to comply only to the part that relates to the activities that you do. So in terms of what activities you do, you have to comply to a set of factors. On average, producers have to comply to around 55 of the factors. For each of those factors, you get if you were compliant and if you had like any minor or major non-compliances or critical non-compliances. And then according to that level, if you have more than 3 major non-compliances, then you would have a different score. So if you didn't have any, then you would be good, or less than 3, then you would be good. If you had if you have more than 3, then you would be generally satisfactory, and then so forth. You would have like improvements necessaries, and you would have like the worst score, which is I forget right now, but it's like major improvements necessary. And then according to that audit outcome, there's an intervention. So if you had a lot of critical factors, then they would decrease, for example, the time period where they do your audits, or they can also revise the approval of the production process. The FSA only handles directly the audits for the slaughterhouses, cutting plants, and the game handling establishments. So they are the ones who take care of the meat sector specifically. For other process, like for example, the restaurants who also handle meat that is done by the local authorities. Now, the audits were implemented by the Food Standard Agency in 2014. So before that, there were not physical audits for the meat operators. They were done mostly through external operators, not directly through the FSA. And then from 2014 onwards, there have been more than 5,600 audits done by the FSA, with a slight reduction in 2020 because of COVID. Now, what has the data that we are using? So we're using mostly data on compliance. So we're using data from the audits to the meat industry. And these audits have been from 2014 and they are updated monthly. So we have up-to-date data and it's disaggregated at each of the FBO level. So it's disaggregated for each of the producers, all the audits that they have done through time. We have data on the firm characteristics, which is of the approved establishments by the FSA. And so when they enter into operation and when they leave or stop producing, and also where they are located, specifically with geographic location, where the plant is located, and what type of activities do they do. And then we also have a company number, which provides us the link to the financial information. And this financial information comes from FAME, which organizes all the data from accounting and balance sheet information from companies, from the company's house data that they have to submit. So this is mostly accounting and financial information. And then we have the demographic information from the English indices of deprivation, which is the main thing that we use. And then this is from the Office of National Statistics. Now, our main dependent variable, or the variable that we're going to study, is the measure of non-compliance, and we're going to focus on the major non-compliances. So this is the distribution that it has followed from 2014 to 2022. But what we want to see is that this is the number of factors that each of the food business operators did not comply to over the total that were applicable. If you remember from previously, I said that even if there are 110 factors, some companies only have to comply to 55, for example. That is the average of the factors. So this is just like a percentage of the number of factors that they didn't comply over the factors that were applicable to each specific company. Now, for the empirical strategy, so we have the percentage of non-compliance, and then we have 3 of the factors. We're still working on including the enforcement indicator. So we have the firm or the corporate characteristics, the director or leadership, and the community element, which would be the context. Now we use both an econometric model. So we use a panel data model with random effects, and we use the machine learning model, which is called xgboost model. Now, the variables that we included for each of the hypotheses. So for the first one, which were the corporate characteristics, we included a major non-compliance, which is our dependent variable. And then the other ones would be the activity, which was divided into the cutting plant, slaughterhouses, or both activities, which is slaughterhouse cutting plant. The meat, which is other, because they can also produce other elements, or poultry or red meat. And the size was defined as large, medium, micro entity, small. And this is according to the balance sheet defined by the company's house. The dummy of change, so one, if they did a change of their name during the year, or 0 otherwise. For the director characteristics, we took into account the percentage of current directors that are women. And then we took an average of the current director age to estimate the mean age of the company leader. Now, for the community, we took into account the number of neighbors, and this is the number of FBOs in the area that are also meat producers, different than the one observed. So how many other people in my area produce meat, the deprivation indexed, and then we included a fixed effect from the region to see how they're like to control for different changes in the regions through time. Now, these are the results for the econometric model. So for our first hypothesis, we have that the activity the effect was positive and significant for the slaughterhouses and the slaughterhouses cutting plants. That means that both of these have a greater percentage of non-compliance than the cutting plants. And the type of meat, that means the poultry or the red meat, came as not significant. For the size, it was positive for medium, small, and micro entities. That means that they have a greater level of non-compliance than larger companies. The name change came as non-significant. The gender diversity was also not significant, which contrasts to a lot of the studies in the literature review. And the mean age of the current directors came out as negative. That means that having an older director reduces the level of non-compliance with respect to having a younger one. The number of neighbors was positive. So if you're located in an area where you have more neighbors that are also meat producers, you have like a higher percentage of non-compliance. The deprivation index in the econometric model came as non-significant, but the region came as significant for both the Southwest and the West of Midlands. And these are areas that, according to the FSA, they have been evidencing a lot of problematics with the follow-through of the regulations. So they have a greater percentage of non-compliance. Now, for the machine learning model, so we implemented this model to take into account a lot of the interaction between the variables. So, for example, deprivation and region can have a lot of correlation between them. So we decided to take that into account and to improve the prediction estimates of the model. So here, deprivation comes as one of the variables that has a greater percentage of impact. And you can see here, is there a question or no? Are we good?
No, don't worry, we'll have the questions at the end in the chat.
Okay,
So,
okay,
yeah.
Perfect, yeah. So here we have the high values are represented by the red, and the low values of the feature are represented by the blue. So here you can see the impact that they have on the model. So higher values of deprivation have a greater impact of non-compliance and so forth. Also, here, the size of the company we measure as a log of total assets, and the current director's mean age also here has an impact, and the number of neighbors. So if you have more neighbors, you're more non-compliant. In this area, the Southwest also comes as important, and slaughterhouses and cutting plants. So doing a recollection of the results of both models, we can see that both for the econometric model and for the xgboost model, we have the activity is important in terms of slaughterhouses and slaughterhouses cutting plants, and they have a greater percentage of non-compliance size. For bigger companies are more compliant than smaller ones. Also for the mean age of current directors, the number of neighbors, and then deprivation index comes as significant for the xgboost model and has more trouble with the traditional econometric methods to capture its significance. And then region, also Southwest and West Midlands come as significant. So this is where we are so far. And the preliminary conclusions that we can gather from this is that in terms of the literature review, so most of the significant and more impactful variables come from corporate characteristics, leadership, enforcement, and context. And this is partly due because of the data that is available to study compliance. So this calls for like a need for more research on those areas, taking into account the importance of stakeholders and behavioral factors, and also more open source information to be able to study those elements. With respect to the data applications, I think that using these factors can improve the prediction of which companies are compliant or not, to be able to use the resources of the public sector, in this case, the Food Standard Agency, more efficiently in order to distribute and to optimize their audits. But there are more variables that maybe we need to include to make the estimation more accurate and to increase the capacity of the prediction. And right now we're working on introducing the enforcement factor and other variables to get it more. Right now, I think we're like the model, I think, predicts with an 84% accuracy, and we are trying to do different types of estimations to try to get it closer to a better accuracy. And I think that's it for me. If you have any questions, I'm here.
Excellent, thank you very much. Let me see, there's a question or a comment from Bryony about the number of neighbours finding, which is very interesting. Did you want to expand on that, Bryony?
Yes, briefly. I mean, I found that really interesting, that finding. Certainly from an economic geography perspective, they would tend to say knowledge is sticky. So if I made a hypothesis, I would assume that operators in the same area would ideally share knowledge and their compliance would be better. But that doesn't look like what you have found. So I'm kind of interested in whether you might comment a little bit more on that.
Yes, so the problem is that there's a difficult relationship between the slaughter, like the food business operators and the FSA. So I guess if if they're closer together, it's not that the knowledge is getting stronger, but that their negative feelings, I think, are getting stronger. So, I mean, that's part of the hypothesis that we have with the FSA right now, because they were also very intrigued by that. We're trying to maybe explore if the adherence to like the unions maybe has an effect and can explain part of why having neighbors would decrease your compliance with respect to having less number of them.
Anybody else have a question? Janet, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Andrea. It's very interesting to get an insight into some of these complex and important areas. I was thinking, after Bryony's question, whether there might be combinations of factors that together make for a more likely non-compliance. So I was thinking that you might get this negative neighbor effect if it tends to be that the smaller the plants are, the more they'll cluster. Whereas if you've got very big plants, I mean, we know already, you said size is a kind of a positive. So if you're bigger, you're less likely to be non-compliant. Maybe you're picking up the fact that you get more neighbors when you're a lot of smaller businesses. I'm thinking of like parts of cities where you have a lot of smaller meat slaughtering and cutting processes that might be going on in proximity, and that might partly explain why you get the negatives. But
yeah, that would be good. Yeah, there could be some interaction effects there. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that would be good to explore. Thank you so much.
Other questions? Damien?
Yeah, thanks for the paper. I guess I'm just thinking about sort of the sort of implications of this then, in terms of, you know, sort of food safety compliance. What do you think it's probably a bit of a difficult question, but the sort of messages are in terms of what we do now around this stuff and what your data is suggesting? Is it suggesting a slightly different take on things in terms of the way that perhaps compliance is kind of currently implemented? You know, maybe building on the sort of comments that Bryony and Janet have just made. If that makes sense as a question.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, I mean, right now we're discussing it with the operations teams in the FSA. So how can these insights be actually put into practice, into policy? So one of the elements is how we distribute audits. So right now they're just, because as I said in the beginning, it's very labor and cost intensive, the way that we audit the meat sector right now. So, but then there's also worrying about how we use this information to focus on some producers to optimize the audits, but because it can be seen as discriminatory. So there's this contrast between using all the information that we have available to try to select or predict which ones are the ones that are going to be less compliant and try to audit them more efficiently without having to having a more efficient process to distribute the labor force that the FSA has available, right? Because right now there's a crisis. There's not that many veterinary professionals that are available to be in the slaughterhouses or even auditors to go. So they have like really a lot of labor restrictions in terms of how many people they have to send to the FBOs. So they have to be really strategic about who they send and where, but then they also have to be careful because of the like lashback that it can have on how they establish who they're going to visit, or what tools and what information you use to predict, because you don't want to discriminate with respect to the smaller companies and only visit them or only go to one specific area. So we're still having that conversation where, like, how do we optimize the use of the data that we have available without having those political problematics, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, because I mean, the sort of question around size, for example, you know, the sort of framing of it, I think is quite important in terms of the sort of messaging that might need to then be tailored to not sort of disengage people or give a sense that if you're really big, then you're really good at this stuff. Whereas, do you know what I mean? That sort of yeah, I suppose the sort of way that translates maybe into then, you know, what might be taken up.
Yeah, they're also exploring maybe having different sets of policies according to the size of the businesses.
Okay.
Because
that would be
because the cost of compliance is quite strong for smaller companies, because they have to implement all this. Like, there's a bunch of forms and like elements that they have to put into place in order to comply to this policies. And of course, for a bigger company, it's easier to implement and to put it into the other maybe plans that they have, and to streamline the whole thing. But for a smaller company, it's just a lot more costly, and they don't have all the personnel to focus on the different activities. So this requires more time that they take out of operation into more like administrative or like logistics stuff involved. So yeah, so there's like a lot of things that we're trying to, like, that's why it was important to try to understand like what's going on, what are the different elements that could be causing non-compliance in the different producers, and then try to find solutions that are both from, like how we audit them, but also like what do we ask of them in some sort.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, thanks very much.
Did you find any parallels with other sectors? You looked specifically at meat, but I wondered if there are these patterns are also emerging with other sectors in food.
Well, not so much in food, but in the literature review, since we took into account all sectors. So we didn't, in the literature review, we didn't really focus on one specific. I mean, size is always the most important factor in everything, like both in the literature review and in the study that we found. But then I don't really know, like I think that's capturing a lot of other stuff that maybe we don't have the data for. So maybe it's capturing a lot of qualitative elements that we're not really identifying in the data, and size is just the one that captures more of that.
Yeah, okay. Great. Anybody else with any questions? No, well, it's a fascinating area, completely new to me and some people here, I'm sure. So thank you for shedding some light on it with your very rich data set.
Janet's popped in a further elaboration. I don't know if it's worth.
It's not worth commenting, don't worry. It's just some
in the
ideas. I
chat.
was just sort of thinking around what I know about where the slaughterhouses are.
Okay, yeah.
Interesting.
Thank you. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you, Andrea, very much. And good luck with the rest of the study.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for listening and your comments.
No problem.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
Take care.
We will pass the comments on to you. So yeah, thank you very much. Thanks a lot. And
Bye,
see you in
everybody.
November. 14th of November is the next seminar. So